Mahatma Gandhi said that the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. Stigma and discrimination against people with mental illness is very much a problem in our society. How do we fix that? Let's have the conversation. Good evening and welcome to The Conversation. I'm your host, Robin Vernon. Negative attitudes and beliefs toward people who have a mental health condition are very common. And we know that stigma can lead to discrimination, which may be obvious and direct, like someone making a negative remark about your mental illness, or worse, making a meme about it. Or it may be subtle, such as someone avoiding you because the person assumes that you could be unstable, violent, or dangerous due to your mental illness. This topic of mental health has been in the spotlight recently because of the challenging times that we are living in, which has resulted in many more people experiencing feelings of anxiety and depression. Stigma and discrimination around mental illness is a major issue in Belize, and that's why we're having the conversation. Our first guest tonight knows only too well what it is like growing up with someone who has a mental disorder. I know it's not easy to speak publicly on this topic, so I say thank you for accepting our invitation. Tamiel Puche, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Tamiel, I understand that you grew up with someone who suffered from a mental illness. Can you tell us what the diagnosis was and what that experience was like?
Well, this was actually my maternal grandmother. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia while taking care of her family and having to raise 3 children. I can only talk about my experience as her grandchild and what I can remember. My other family members, my mom in particular, would have a much longer experience, one I would say spanning several decades. Memories are a funny thing, each person's memory, I believe, of a particular event or space in time has similarities and differences when compared to other people. Growing up, the experience for me was definitely not easy at times and certainly confusing at times as well. But for the most part, she was my grandmother, and she was a special part of my life up until the very day she died.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you said that you can only speak from the perspective of her grandmother. I mean, as her grandchild, which I completely understand. At any point when you spoke to family members or friends of your grandmother, did you maybe find out how it manifested itself, like how it began and what her symptoms were at the time?
Yeah, well, from the experience and information shared with me over the years, I can say it emerged as a result of domestic abuse. This abuse was very violent, very traumatic. During episodes of what we call psychosis, there were a lot of symptoms that she displayed. Something we used to call split personality back in the day, which is far better explained these days. She would suffer paranoia. She would be extremely angry. She would express anger to people not even there sometimes. Her voice and demeanor changed significantly. She had issues with sleep. She would forget to eat, shower. She would walk all up and down the floors and even the street sometimes. She would at times forget to put on her clothes or take off her clothes and even walk outside in public nude, Because her eyesight was failing, she would sometimes walk in the middle of the street because she was afraid to fall into drains. And a lot of the times, she felt, I think, like she had to defend herself from everyone, especially when she was paranoid. She would do things like bury things in the yard. She would break things or clean things until they broke. She would even accuse people of things that they were doing or things that they weren't doing. So there was a lot that I can remember in terms of what the diagnosis was and what the symptoms were that she showed.
And this entire culmination of symptoms and behavior, this was all the result of trauma from her abuse, you said?
Yes,
Well, first
it
of all,
was.
I just want to say that I'm sorry to hear that your grandmother had to deal with that she had to go through that. But it's very important for our viewers to understand that this actually ties into actually my first episode of domestic abuse, where it's just another result of what abuse can do to someone. I mean, this isn't always like the main cause. This is in no way the main cause. But having you speak on this as a result of abuse is very important for people to understand that this is the extent that abuse can go to. So again, I'm sorry to hear this, and thank you again for being with us, and I'm glad that I could be able to talk to you about this and be able to shed some light on a very serious topic.
Yeah, it's a topic that's really hard to discuss, especially when it's tied to so many things and tied to family members and stuff like that. But I also think it's one that's very important, especially with what's going on
Yeah,
these days.
it's really rough. And if I may ask, how difficult was it for your family to care for your grandmother? Were there challenges that you all faced when it came to the day-to-days?
Well, when it came to taking care of her, I'd say that the majority of the burden while I was growing up was felt by my mom. My aunt actually also struggled to provide financially to help my grandmother while taking care of her own family overseas as well, and dealing with her own struggles. But she also did all she could during like visits home and stuff like that. But during my time, I think the full degree of the difficulty would be, a whole other series that would entail my mom. But we grew up with my mom struggling on a day-to-day basis to take care of, us, her family, her work, while she was going to school, while also taking care of my grandmother.
Yeah.
It was extremely difficult, especially during the episodes of psychosis. My mom had to deal with neighbors being frustrated, people who were ignorant in regard to mental illness. I can remember things like helping my mom to scrub body waste off of the floors, police in our house manhandling her when she was being medicated by nurses. Um, Waiting for my mom to make sure she showered or she ate, having to feed and bathe her on a chair in the bedroom because she was so paranoid of taking a shower. My mom and dad had to juggle work, things like driving us to Rockview to visit her and take supplies. There were,
Wow.
so many things that we had to deal with, like missing family gatherings with family right here in Belmopan or in Belize City or anywhere else because my mom couldn't go too far for too long. I remember a lot of sleepless nights, especially after she would be released from like Rockview, because the medication that they gave her insomnia. I can remember hearing her rub her feet raw, like just this noise, just to try to comfort herself. Um, as a result, I think we do it too as well now. I can remember things like, fights between my mom and my grandmother over her food because she was paranoid that my mom was trying to do something to her. Us sitting down and having breakfast while all of this is going on, and my mom worrying about having to leave her at home unattended because, she had to go to work herself, you know. So it was hard. And then there were times when she was very lucid. So the paranoia was even more. And, that was tough too, because when they're medicated, well, at least my grandmother, a lot of the times it turned her into a zombie. It kind of killed her personality. She wouldn't smile, she wouldn't laugh, she wouldn't sing, which is something that she loved to do. She wouldn't even hug us, she wouldn't hold our hands and, rub them and just the things that she would normally do. It was almost like two extremes. Like she just was another completely different person.
So the care took a toll in many different ways, basically, where
Yeah.
your family sacrificed a lot with their caring for her. That care took a lot on your family when it came to sometimes tensions rising due to the frustration in certain instances where her psychosis would be to the point where certain things like just feeding her became complicated. It was all like from the many different angles, it all just took its toll.
Yeah, and I know a lot of other families who experience the same thing. I mean, not just ours. I mean, I know of a lot of people who are in or have experienced similar situations. I know of one particular case in Belmopan where a family lost their son, brother. He was admitted to Rockview, and after can't remember if it was a few weeks or a few months, he disappeared. We assumed that he walked off the compound, and no one ever found him again. And these are things that people don't really know about. People don't talk about.
Very, very
You know?
real, very real instances. Wow. And you touched briefly on another question where you were talking about how your community or society basically reacted to your grandmother's, let's call them episodes, like your grandmother's episodes. Would you be able to shed more light on what the reaction from the community was like when it came to like how you said you had examples of ignorance, you had examples of insults, like however comfortable it is for you to just touch lightly on what that was like?
Well, I would say from the community, I would say that the it was very mixed. The reaction was very mixed. You'd have people like closest to my mom who were more understanding. Not all of them either. You had some neighbors that were understanding, some who just didn't want to deal with the crazy lady living next to them. Looking at it now, I would think it would have been unfair for us to really expect them to be happy about it. But, we could only hope and pray that they would have some level of compassion for her and for
Yeah.
the situation.
Yeah.
You had some who were helpful, some we found out after, like, the fact, you know, after years that they were actually taking advantage, and these were people who were actually, a part of the society, people who are supposed to protect her. So, it's hard. And then when you're dealing with somebody, especially in this case where it was schizophrenia, you have to listen, you have to observe, you have to get different, hear the story from different places to really gauge what's going on. Because a lot of the times it would just say, that it was her and her challenges and what she was going through. But when in truth, a lot of the things that she was saying was true, but, it's hard to deal with. So it was really stressful at times.
I can imagine. I've seen examples throughout my life as well. The general populace's different reaction to different examples of mental illness where they would clown, they would show concern, some would even show aggravation. For some reason that I cannot understand, some would actually try to take advantage through abuse to these people, like they got a kick out of abusing people. And you can even see on some videos circulating our social media with our own local Belizeans who are afflicted with different forms of mental illness. And it's the same thing. It's the same general reaction. These people are posting these videos and the comments are just disappointing. The comments are disappointing because you see the different, just the overall reaction is not what you would hope for something like that. And if I'm being honest with you, despite the fact that I'm concerned, even I have to admit that certain instances did make me chuckle or did make me laugh. And as much as I'm disappointed in myself with that, it's just we as a society, certain things have just become comedic, but they shouldn't be. And as much as we're able to be honest about that, we have to recognize that it is a problem, and we have to think about how we as a society can foster this moving forward. And so I just feel that's very important. We're going to touch that later, but I just feel like that's very important to have noted with what you just said. And due to like the overall reactions, everything going on out there, stigma usually comes from a lack of understanding or fear. Everything usually comes from a lack of understanding or fear. And the effect that can have on people, it varies from person to person, from family to family. Would you be able to shed some light on how that affected you and your family?
Well, in case of stigma and discrimination, there are so many instances where we experience those. But just to, I guess, give, just a little bit of what that was like, you would have people who would say things like, I really don't want to be around this person. What if I catch what she have, I can remember one incident in particular when I was younger. I was at the Catholic Church here in Belpan, Our Lady of Guadalupe, with my classmates, actually, and children from several of the other classes. As we were practicing for confirmation. My grandmother actually came in to the church, and she was obviously at that time speaking to herself. That's another symptom, of her schizophrenia. So she was speaking to herself. She actually went in to pray to the Virgin Mary, because that's one of the things that she did a lot. Okay. And while she was there, it was one of her bad days. I can admit that, But the kids, they started laughing and yelling. Someone said, look at the crazy old lady. And then somebody else said, shh, shut up. That's Tamara Granny. And I honestly don't remember a teacher really disciplining any of these students for like their rude or, responses or their reactions. It's one of the many reasons now that I don't even attend mass, especially at the same church, where my brother and my sister and I, we were a part of the children's choir. Because, we didn't really lose our faith in our beliefs. We lost faith in people, Yeah. Stigma has, I would say, a very negative effect on situations and on people. The effect could either be short-term or long-term, but, how we react to these things, a lot of times we're not aware of the fact that we don't understand the situation. We don't know the person, and like you said earlier, we're human. Even I would have to admit there are times when, we speak about the situation, but that's our personal, situation. So as far as I'm concerned, that's something that we're able to talk about. I'm able to talk about my grandmother. Yeah. We have times where, we would talk about her and we would laugh. My sister would, kind of do the other voice, if you want to call it, that she had. And, we would try to find humor in it and stuff like that. But that's in a particular setting with particular individuals, people that we trust, people that we know, people that knew her, right? So, we're only human and we'll all have reactions. But, when it comes to stigma and the discrimination, it can really affect people for a long time. We might think it's just, something one-off, and oh well, that shouldn't bother her. But they have no idea people's background and people's experiences and
No idea
why
and no
they,
say, in all
yeah, exactly,
honesty.
why you might react strongly to a
Yeah,
specific topic. For example, a topic like this,
yeah.
where, for example, if you go and call somebody crazy, especially somebody out on the street who obviously has a mental disorder or mental challenge, I would get pretty upset. But because of my experience with that with my grandmother,
It has a more personal meaning for you.
exactly,
Yeah, and
exactly.
you've said it twice already, and we're actually going right into the next question with that is your thoughts on the term crazy, the label crazy. Because the standard thing I feel here and many other places too is that, again, for people who don't understand, when they see any form of mental instability or any form of mental illness, they don't know enough to be able to go, oh, this is that, or these are symptoms of this. They're just going to say, oh, that person crazy. And then like they'll move on. What are your thoughts on labeling, and what are your thoughts on crazy?
Well, I think that it's really easy for us to place thoughts, actions, and like people in boxes. Just label them, stick them in a closet, and leave them there. I mean, let's be honest, who wants to deal with difficult shit, right?
Yeah.
But I know I don't enjoy it, but we love to use that word crazy, and it can be extremely destructive and
Yeah.
hurtful when used as a weapon. I mean, people aren't crazy, their actions might be, but people are people. We're all human. I mean, if you look at the list of disorders that's recognized in psychiatry, you'll find things like insomnia, anxiety, depression, ADD, ADHD, PTSD, substance abuse, things like erectile disorder. I mean, tell me, do these things mean that you're also crazy because you experience these disorders? So these disorders and illnesses, just like you have, are illnesses like you would have an illness as a result of heart disease or diabetes. It's a malfunction of
I
the
was
human body,
literally thinking the
right?
same thing. Yeah.
But the brain is a part of the body, isn't it? I mean, we try to get help for people with physical impairments, and we generate so much sympathy, empathy, compassion for these people. Why not mental health? Why not mental illness? What's the difference?
And the thing is, I feel like on the spectrum of things, like on the wider scope of things, this is one where outside support would actually play a far larger role than most others. I'm not diminishing any illness. I'm not in any way diminishing any of that. But things like depression, things like schizophrenia, these anxiety, these different forms of mental illness, these things have to me, they have like a common solution or one solution that I feel would at least help to treat them, not cure them, but treat them. And to me, that's support. To me, that's the feeling of feeling like you're not alone. It's the compassion and the love from outside. I feel that would help in some way to just soften the affliction. I mean, someone could tell me if I'm wrong, and I would gladly, I would take that, and I would want to be educated on why I'm wrong about that, because it's something so serious that I want to know, because I myself, I have my own stuff going on, to put it in that way, right? And I know people who have their own afflictions as well. So the more educated I could be on it, it would help me to understand as well. And
That's the thing, though. I think a lot of us, it's easier for us to continue our days, our daily lives, and just pretend like some of these things don't exist. It's easier said than done. I mean,
true.
look at what we're just seeing just most recently in the media on the most recent in suicide.
Yeah.
It's just easier to pretend like these things don't exist and ignore that the person next to you might be going through these things and you have no idea,
For
none
some people,
whatsoever.
it's just easier to ignore than to acknowledge and to try to work through it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Tammy, I heard that later on in your life, you had to assess your own mental health. And if I can ask, how did you go about that? How did you start? How did you work on you?
Well, it's been a long journey, but in terms of how it started, I'd say that it began with a brutally honest boss that I had. Actually, she was very young, my age, and she asked me one question, one simple question. We were having a conversation, and I think probably we were having probably an argument about something. And she asked me simply, she's like, why is it that you're always so passive aggressive, you know? And I think that's where my kind of worms kind of opened. And at that time, I was trying really hard to help a coworker through some really tough times, having no idea whatsoever that that coworker's challenge was having a direct impact on my own challenges that I wasn't even aware of. So I would say that's where that started.
Okay. And what did you do to address that or to begin to work on that?
Well, at that time, the establishment where I was working had an employee assistance program. And so I decided to take advantage of that, which not everyone has access to this type of support. And I was really trying to dig deep and doing all I could because really I wanted to change my reactions to specific things. And to do that, I really needed to understand what the hell it was that I was doing, and even more so, why. I was scared, wondering if, the gene factor in regards to my grandmother was playing a significant role. And if that was now my challenge, but it turns out that that definitely was not the case.
Okay. It's from me now, from me to you. It's tough, isn't it? Trying to work on something that we barely understand, but we know is something innate, like it's something with us, and just trying to find what we feel would be the best solution to help. But I feel it's important for people to know that it's possible. It's possible to be able to take that step, to be able to work on it, and to be able to want to see yourself at least be a little better each day. For me, it's always that first step. That first step is
Yeah.
very important.
And that first step is never easy
No,
because first of
no, it's
all,
not.
you have to admit that, that there's a problem, a challenge, there has to be room for you to want to change something or question something, and most people don't want to do that because that's definitely not easy.
Yeah, I myself was in denial for quite a while, to be totally honest. And as the years went by, I realized that it's not something that I could continue to be on because I started to see how it affected my mind. I started to see how it affected my emotions and how it even affected me physically. And I myself took that step. I started to see a therapist at first, and that helped me get through some. And then afterwards, I started to just be able to hold my own hand and try to just walk myself through it. And I was glad. I was glad that I finally came around to taking that step. And it was hard, but as time went by, it's definitely gotten easier for me. And
And even so, I mean, even through my journey, even up to now, I still find it difficult to hold my own hand. I can hold everybody else's hand. I can solve everybody else's problem.
You
I
are
can
speaking to the choir with that. You are preaching, sorry, to the
organize
choir with
the
that.
world, get people on track.
Yeah.
I can, there's so many things that I can do. Don't ask me to do it for myself.
I know.
It's not possible.
I know that truly. And throughout your situation with your grandmother, what lessons have you learned from that to actually help you cope with your own challenges? Do you feel that there were things that you learned through your time with your grandmother that aided you in your journey?
Yeah, there were. There are like so many things that we try to do, but I think one of the most important things is to really remember that we're all human. I heard this word compassion being used very recently, and I think that's something a word that we really need to try to understand the meaning of. And once we really understand what that means, I think to, you know, try to somehow dig that up from inside of us. Um, there's so many things going on with so many people, especially right now in the current situation that we're in. It just makes it harder for everybody. And I think when we put people in a box and we add judgments to that and assumptions, it just makes it even more difficult.
I agree.
I know everybody right now wants to have a say. And a lot of us, are obsessed and engaged with social media every day. But I think it's important that we try to remember, like I said, that these people are human. They're human beings. They're, somebody's son, somebody's daughter, somebody's mother, somebody's grandmother. And we just need to try to have more compassion. I mean, most one of the things that comes to mind most recently is that video on social media in Belmopan here, where somebody stood behind a tree and videoed a female obviously going through something really difficult. There were so many things that he could have done. He could have tried to call someone to get help, but he actually stood there and videoed and laughed. And the laughing is what really, I think, got to me, because fine, if you don't know how that person will react. She was obviously agitated, very aggressive, but to stand behind somewhere hidden and video and post that on social media, that's not the best way to seek help for someone.
And that's like something that I find myself talking to my friends and my family about as well, that when it comes to these examples, you actually get an eye opener on both the affliction as well as the general populace. Because the video says a lot about what that young lady was going through, but it also said a lot about the person videoing. And that's the two sides to the coin with things like this, where you have these people clearly suffering from an affliction somewhere or the other, but then you have these people who you would think are capable of helping, but just weren't like able to in that given moment. And with everything that you said prior to this, where your words of encouragement, your thoughts, your opinions on what we can do or what we should want to be able to do to help with these things, I feel like that's important for people to note and for people to understand, because everyone's going through something. It's like you said, like there aren't crazy people it's just the symptoms of what it is they're dealing with. And Tammy, with just these questions alone, you've given us more than enough of a glimpse into what this is like, what families, what friends, and what the afflicted go through. And it's a lot, and I'm sure that there's so much more that you'd want to say on it. And I'm hoping that we could keep in touch and be able to do more for this, because as much awareness as we could bring into it would be great. So for now, Tammy, I just want to thank you for being with us, for sharing such a touching and very serious story and peek into your life.
Yeah. Before we go, I just want to point out something though that's
Sure.
very, very important. You mentioned earlier, you talked about support, right? And how important support is. Well, one of the things that, and I'm talking about from my own personal experience, having my own personal, challenges with, what I like to call my unique challenges, right? With a mental disorder. And one of the things that I've heard quite a lot lately is, but so then why you never get help? Or, but they could have easily asked for help. And one of the things that we need to be very aware of, at least here in Belize, is that getting support, one, from your family is not easy. In most cases, even if you acknowledge the fact that you have a challenge and one that needs, that needs attention, and you have to get help from somewhere or someone, it's not that easy. From my own experience, I know for a fact that while we can say go out and get help, help isn't readily available. The resources here in Belize are very limited. The people who we have who are employed in the public system to assist with these things, those people are stretched thin,
True.
And while you have people who have the ability to go and seek help as individuals professionally, not everyone can afford that. And not everyone would be willing to go to a public facility to seek this help. I know that because I'm one of them. And I could just be honest, right? You go into the clinic, it's a public clinic, and there's a huge label on that. And as you walk in there are people, obviously might be people outside who might know you, might not know you. And the minute you go in there, you're labeled, oh, she crazy, And it's really difficult when, let's say, for example, you're out in public and someone saw you go into that special little space in that public clinic. The first thing they do, elbow the person next to them. Hey, see that girl there? I say she that a crazy place, She made it there. She done right, so she crazy, my girl. It's just as bad as people having to go to the hospital and being diagnosed with HIV and hearing that for the first time, and that being, advertised to everybody in the area. Everybody knows. Or going in to the emergency because you have a complication.
Yeah.
And everybody knowing your status. These things aren't private. So it's hard for people, even if they're experiencing this, to actually go and ask for help. And then when you go and ask for help, you have all these judgments that you have to deal with.
That's very true. That's very true. Thank you so much for sharing that, Tammy. That's equally as important with everything else that we discussed. Viewers, we'll take a short break and be right back to continue this discussion. Tammy, again, Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
You too.
I got fired for opening up and letting them know that I suffer from PTSD, anxiety, depression, and a borderline personality disorder. And I also assured them that it would not affect me working, but they never want to risk it.
With my borderline personality disorder, it makes me really impulsive. I tend to lie, especially to my parents. This is how it looks when, you're having a breakdown.
Welcome back to the conversation. Tonight, we're talking about mental illness, and joining me in the studio for the second segment is Mrs. Kathy Esquivel, who has been a lifelong advocate for mental health in Belize. Welcome to the show, Ms. Kathy.
Thank you for having me.
Mrs. Kathy, from the clip we just saw and from the interview with Tammy, how important do you think these conversations are, and what do you want viewers to come away with?
All right. Well, I want to really thank Tammy, because it's not easy.
No, it's not.
To be so public. And it's very important. Now, I know something of what she's thinking, because actually my brother-in-law was schizophrenic. He's now passed. And so we were his caregivers. And we know that, he used to walk the neighborhood and go over trash piles and find pretty things. But actually he was relatively easy. I mean, he wasn't violent, and we made sure he kept to his medication.
Okay.
But we know that a lot of people were very negative about him. Why do they let him walk the street? Well, because he has a right to walk the street. He's not doing any harm. But I think taking that attitude helps, because actually when he died, his funeral was really touching, because the number of people that came to his funeral, like the library service, because he loved to read, so he often went to the library. So the people from the library came out, and some of the neighbors that he used to run little errands for, go buy a Coke or do whatever. And I thought it was touching that they saw him as a person, and they mourned his passing. And so I think if we ourselves are open, it helps other people to be open.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. That really is beautiful. And Ms. Esquivel, what is your interest in mental health?
Well, partly because of Billy. Actually, I did years ago in prehistory. My degree is actually in psychology, but I haven't used it as such. And I was interested, and at some point, when my husband was in a position, I was invited to a conference on mental health, and I gave a speech, as people do. And I was encouraged, well, why don't you try and start something? So we actually started something called the Mental Health Advisory Board. And we had people from all the stakeholders. And so that's how it started. It later became an NGO, the Mental Health Association.
And this is here?
Yeah, but one of the things we did, one of the first things is we actually got attempted suicide decriminalized, because attempted suicide was a criminal offense.
Really?
And back in 1997, we said, no, this doesn't make sense. So we asked,
no, it does not.
We were told, okay, but you have to show that people want to do this. The Sulgen told us. So we sent out questionnaires, we spoke to people, and amazingly, everybody said, yes, we want it decriminalized. So the police, the magistrates, the churches, all of the churches, Everybody.
So it was just a wave of advocacy for
The
to have this
political
taken down.
parties. So once
great.
we could show that everybody supported it, then the Solgen produced the legislation, and attempted suicide was no longer, because if you attempt suicide, you're in crisis. The last thing you need to do is be taken to the police station.
Exactly, and just have further pressure.
Right, and the police
tension
didn't want it either, but that was the law.
Wow,
So we were very proud of that.
that's great.
We kept working, and one of the things we managed to do was to get funding to build an acute unit. And it was actually built at the Belmopan Hospital. Now, the idea of an acute unit is that mental illness is what we call a chronic disease. It's not something you cure, but like if you have high blood pressure, you don't cure it, but you can keep it under control.
Yeah.
But occasionally it might spike. Well, the same thing with mental illness. I suspect with Tammy's grandmother, one of her problems was that the medications only became available in the late 1960s, and her grandmother probably started to show signs
Earlier
before
than
that.
Yeah.
And the medication has improved. What they have now is much better. So, yeah, we got an acute unit built. We passed it over to the Ministry of Health. And the idea is that it's partly against stigma and discrimination. So, and I see where you been? Oh, I was at the hospital. Well, people go to the hospital. I wasn't in any institution.
They weren't
I
going
was
to
at the
specify.
hospital.
Yeah, they weren't going to specify.
But I do have to say that the medical community also has to work on their attitudes. The specialists understand very well, but the general medical community, I think, needs to work on their own education. And let me give you an example. When they were refurbishing the Belmopan Hospital and moving things around, they said, hey, we need somewhere to put maternal and child care. Oh, the acute unit, we could use that. Like, that's not important. And it took 9 or 10 months of a lot of lobbying and advocacy finally to get it back. Because even after the refurbishing was done, they didn't give it back.
Really?
So we got it back. And it worked for a long while. One of the reasons we got it open again was there was an incident, you might remember, a woman who was suffering severe problems. She actually drowned some of her children.
Oh my goodness.
And one little boy survived. And so she was being held, but she needed to be held in a proper place. And that's how we got the acute unit reopened.
Wow.
But it doesn't stop there. Obviously, with COVID, they needed a specialized COVID ward, and we fully appreciate that.
But in prioritizing...
But guess which unit they decided was not important enough.
The ward,
so they've taken over the acute unit. Now, I am not saying we don't need a COVID unit, but I'm saying, why is it that the assumption is that, oh, the acute unit, that's not important, and so we don't have an acute unit?
So it's becoming, this is what, the second time that it's been
the second
refurbished to accommodate a different affliction. So now, like,
so
I know
our
it's only
fear
twice, but it's
is
basically becoming a
once
trend.
they close the COVID ward, will they decide, oh, well, we don't really need the acute unit, we could use it for something else?
And that says a lot about their view on mental illness and overall medical support
for
mental illness.
And I think So it's not just the general public that needs to look at their attitudes. I think everybody does.
Everybody should.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that, wow, that's a shocker. That one is a shocker. I couldn't even get into my next question just then. Wow. I know that we heard some from Ms. Tammy when she was speaking, but if we could just get some of your thoughts on stigma and discrimination and its effects on individuals and families.
Well, it is very difficult, especially with psychotic illnesses. It's very difficult for you to put yourself in that person's shoes. And so something we don't understand, we tend to fear. And sometimes when we're afraid, we laugh because it breaks the tension.
I know, I do that. I do that
So,
every chance I get.
I would say this thing about videoing and posting to social media, well, it's a disgrace that someone takes a video. It's a disgrace that social media allows such things to be posted. But it's a disgrace if you decide you're going to watch it and share it with someone. So don't put all the blame on everyone else. If you opened it and looked at it, and if you shared it, you're part of the problem.
So there's guilt to be felt at every level.
Everybody. Guilt is everywhere.
Yeah. I can take that. I can take that. I can take that, and I can agree with that because it is true. And it once again it touches the very thing that I told Ms. Tammy, that I myself, like in my times when I would view some of these examples or something like that, like I might say, like I would have a chuckle or something of the sort. But see, I do that because that's a very terrible coping mechanism of mine.
It's common.
But I am honest enough with myself that I know it's a problem. I don't try to hide behind it. I don't try to ignore it. I don't try to dismiss it because I feel that doesn't help. That doesn't help. And it's important for people to recognize, like you said, that not for any way in particular, but there is guilt to be shared in this because any one of us in any circumstance can put an end, or at least contribute to putting an end to someone's suffering in terms of how they appear in the public eye, or the circulating of these things. And social media is a pain with that, I agree, because in my opinion, the policies on social media is very skewed. Like it's so inaccurate, I feel, because you have violence. I completely understand. You have pornography, you have nudity, you have all of that. But you're telling me right now that somehow it's become societally acceptable to view someone very clearly suffering from an affliction, and no one can vet that and say that should be taken down. It's terrible because
actually
a lot of things far less severe have been taken down.
You can. I don't think people do this enough. You can actually contact Facebook and ask for certain content to be removed.
You can report it. Yeah.
You can report it.
Yeah, you can.
And I think if people, instead of looking at it and giggling it and forwarding it to someone else, you could report it to Facebook, ask for it to be taken down because the family and other people are suffering. So that is something positive that you can do. Now I have to admit, I don't do social media. I don't do Facebook, partly because it disgusts me. But most other people do. And so if you're doing that, there is something positive you can do. You can report it to Facebook and ask for them to take it down.
I agree. Well, before we get into our
let's
question,
not go on to Facebook.
No. Before we get into our next question, though, let's take a brief look at some examples of exactly what it is we're discussing right now.
So I really want to thank the officer for assisting me, because this guy attacked me from Bakang with a pizza. Imagine if it was a bat or a machete. Come on, man. So when I reached to the station, they told me that the guy is mental child, and I'm the second person that he assaulted.
You know, we call policeman, police, if you don't want to deal with whatever.
It's my money, I do nothing to do. Yeah, but he look. It's mine.
What did you do, yeah?
Falls right into what it is.
Very
we're talking
disturbing.
about.
And people, I think, often don't know what to do. You know, I mean, if someone was doing that, I couldn't go and stop it. Now, we have a really dedicated, and I think Tammy mentioned this, we have dedicated psychiatric nurse practitioners, at least one in each district. We have, I think, 2 psychiatrists right now. We have, I say we, I mean the country,
Okay.
Through the Ministry of Health. And certainly the emphasis has to be on community support and deinstitutionalization. A lot of people's first thought is, lock them people up. Well, yeah, if someone commits an offense, they probably do have to be.
Or even if in an episode they were displaying some type
Right.
of violent tendency or something of the sort.
So I'm not saying we just forget about it, but locking people up. Now, our laws in Belize are really archaic. The problem is we, at independence, we had the laws that were current in Britain.
In place at the time.
Our laws for mental health go back to the 1930s and 1940s.
Okay.
And obviously they've been upgraded elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Now we have as many laws, but we only have a few legal draftspeople, so it's hard to upgrade them. But our laws on mental illness are very archaic. That's one thing that needs a real expert to look at.
Our laws and the mindset.
Yeah, but sometimes laws come first. For instance, there are ways to lock people up, but there's no way to get out. I mean, the laws cover how people can be locked up,
But not how they can be
but
released.
not how they can get out. So what we need the acute unit back, and we need acute beds in each district hospital. When I say an acute bed, it has to be a bed that's specially put aside, 1 or 2 beds for such cases. They might have to be in a safe room. I mean, you don't want just a bed in a general ward. You might have to have some restrictions or safety measures.
Yeah, like a controlled environment.
Yes, a controlled environment. So we need that. We need the acute unit, and we need an acute unit in Belize City at KHMH, because if you're in an acute phase, you don't really need to be taken all the way to Belmopan.
I'm sure that friends, families, and even people who are conscious of their own afflictions can agree this isn't a it would be nice, this isn't a we would want, we need an acute ward for these things, because as this trend of video sharing is becoming more and more evident, this is pretty rampant here in Belize. Like, this is a pretty
you know what?
big thing.
It's not something new. I mean, I remember there have always been characters. Actually, I wrote a book. It's an adventure, but the main character has schizophrenia. And I mean, I remember there was someone called T-Bone Steak, someone called Chicky Lick with the bamboo stick, and the kids would chase after and tease.
Oh, goodness.
And then you see, especially T-Bone, he was wonderful because he'd turn round and he'd shout at the kids and wave, and that would make them laugh. So And
had one like
this is
that
going
when
back
was.
30, 40 years.
Yeah, I remember
So-
from my childhood we had
Yeah,
one.
so it's not new. What is new is the sharing, widespread sharing.
Yeah, the
So-
platform.
To go back, we need the acute units, the acute beds. But we also, because the idea of the acute unit, it's only for 2-3 weeks. Because it's when you have an acute episode, you need to be stabilized. You still have a chronic illness, but you need to be stabilized.
So while we're on that then, while we're on the subject of the treatment, how would you define mental illness? And at the same time, speaking about the acute unit and the beds and the atmosphere, how would you treat it? Or what would be ways that people can begin to treat it?
Well, I'm not a doctor, so I wouldn't discuss that.
Okay.
But there are people in Belize who are trained and know how to do these things. So, as I say, there are medications now that are very effective. But, you know, even people who who have some other chronic disease, they have high blood pressure, and they say, oh, and I take my pill every day, only when I feel bad. No, you're supposed to take it every day. So even with any chronic disease, you have people who are not compliant with medication, and that's true of mental illness. Now, especially if you have a mental illness that makes you paranoid, you might even more so. We have a group of community mental health workers, psychiatric nurse practitioners. I know in Belize City they know all their clients, and if someone hasn't come in for their medication, they'll actually go out on the street and look for them. And,
Really?
yeah, and say, you know, encourage them.
Okay.
But not everyone you can do that with.
Of course.
The Mental Health Association, we got money from SIF, and we built the Welcome Resource Center. That's at the end of Vernon Street.
Okay.
And that's just for social support, no medication, but the nurses do visit. But that you can get a hot meal, well, 3 meals. You can get breakfast, lunch, and a snack. You go in, you take a shower, you have a change of clothes, you can sit, you can play games. There's some different.
It gives some form of positive stimulus.
Yes,
to
and
those
it's
going through it.
somewhere to go.
Yeah.
We always need money to keep going.
Of course.
But we've been open for 7 years now.
That's great.
And that's social support. And as Tammy said, people say why their families don't, well, it's not easy. And some families do support their relatives. Some families are so stretched thin trying to survive, they don't have anything
they're
left.
unable to carry, like,
And
even
some
that, you know.
families have many of the people in the family with severe mental illnesses, so there's no one to look after anyone else. So, yeah, families could do more, but some families can't.
And it's important to be aware of that, yeah.
So we need that support, but what we also need is we need something called a forensic unit. Now, this is a very small unit, and we need the legal framework. Because when someone is really violent or going through a really, really difficult episode, they can't really be taken to an acute unit because they're too dangerous, too violent.
Yeah.
So a forensic unit is very secure, and the idea should be only that they don't keep you for longer than a month because it's not a prison. They stabilize you, and from there you can either be released to your family, or you can be released to go to an acute unit for more treatment.
For additional treatment.
Or if you have committed an offense, you might have to go to the prison.
But you can be
And
assessed.
there is a unit in the prison that they keep people with, and the psychiatrist visits regularly.
Really?
Yeah. But we need a forensic unit because sometimes a family is distraught. They have a family member they're afraid of that person because they're in such an acute phase. They won't take their medication and they're violent, and the family doesn't know what to do. And they're afraid that they might hurt a family member, they might hurt themselves, they might hurt a neighbor, but they don't want to call the police because they're scared that the police
will additional harm,
Yeah.
like bring additional harm to the person.
Yeah.
This.
So none of these things can be done overnight, but you have to have a vision of where you're trying to go.
And you have to have that want. You have to have that desire.
And you have to get other people to buy in.
Exactly, and we're speaking more from just, as again, the general public. We're also speaking of this as a plea to the medical field as well, the specialists out there and the people who can actually assist with these things and be able to bring these things to fruition and advocate for it. Oh, this is a lot. This is a lot. And I feel like we only just scratched the surface with how in-depth of a thing this is, because there's so much more questions that I would want to ask both you and Miss Tammy. And it just pains me that we're pressed for time. It honestly pains me that we're pressed for time. But
the police also they do have some training when they first go to training school, but it needs to be ongoing. And, the little training you get can't teach you everything you need. And they need to know where they can take people, because the police are the only ones that can pick you up without your consent.
To be able to control a situation,
legally. Yeah. And they can take you to a clinic or an emergency room or whatever. And so there is training that has worked internationally to help the police, because it's very embarrassing and difficult. I mean, even with good heart, sometimes a policeman having to pick up someone who is naked and fighting, that's not easy for them.
That's indecent.
So they need training so that they are better prepared to dealing with very difficult situations.
I agree. I feel it's important for people to know that the knowledge is important, and everyone can get help with being educated with it. Everyone can get assistance with learning more and understanding more. But there's a fundamental point where it really becomes that individual's responsibility to further learn, to further understand. Like the assistance and the help and everything can only take you so far when it comes to an outsider having you try to understand, but not until you're there, not until you're in the moment, you're in the situation, and you're facing this person or you're facing this situation. Then and only then can you be able to really open your mind and think the best approach, what this person really needs. Because you know as a person what you want to do. You know what you want to do to be able to control the situation or try to diffuse the situation. But you also have to think about what that person needs at that moment. And I feel like this is why it's important for people to want to read up about this, for people to want to talk more with their loved ones, with their friends, with their families, talk more and just listen to how people are doing. Pay attention to how people are doing. Don't take someone saying, I feel like I could cry right now as like a joke. I'm just going, ha ha ha, you think you want to cry? I want to cry. Like not turn it into a competition, or not turn it into something where like it's a form of weakness, or it's this or it's that. Because the minute you start to do that, you fall right back into the general demographic where it's just, we're going to ignore it. It's whatever. that's weakness. We aren't for weakness. You have to want to be able to talk about these difficult things.
Well, yeah, because when we talk about mental illness, we tend to concentrate on the psychotic illnesses because they're so obvious and in your face. But anxiety and depression are hidden illnesses because you're not out there on the street. In fact, if you're depressed, you might not be out there at all. You know,
you would be withdrawn.
And so there are many things that can be done. And as Tammy said, there's a lot of psychologists now in Belize, but you can't necessarily afford that. But the psychiatric nurse practitioners do a certain amount, but they are stretched thin. So we have to recognize that, yes, the psychotic illnesses are the ones that show up, but there's a lot of hidden illnesses. And when someone says they're thinking of suicide, don't ignore it.
Do not.
Because the very fact that they're sharing that is saying...
It says a lot.
That,
it's a cry for help,
So you might not be able to help, but you might be able to get someone else to help.
I agree.
So it's very important, as you say, it's called psychological first aid. You need to listen, you need to look and assess the situation, and then you need to do something that will help and not make matters worse.
Yeah. Ms. Kathy, thank you so much for shedding light on so many different aspects of this complex issue. And Tammy, if you're still watching, thank you as well. I appreciate you both in ways that you do not understand. And we wanted to do this even before current events. We wanted to do this for quite some time because we felt that it was important to bring this on the table. And knowledge is power, and we could all potentially be better citizens if we educate ourselves in any form, whether it be using the very same internet that people are using to share these things. You can use that same internet to find ways to be able to rectify and to be able to understand more of what's going on. And it's clear that something needs to change. Something truly needs to change. And we need to start more sooner than later, I feel. We'll take a final break and we will be right back. Stick with us. And as always, please, 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 keep an open mind. It's clear that mental health care must be comprehensive and target the population as a whole when it comes to changing behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes. Stigma and discrimination can have extremely harmful effects. It can make people reluctant to seek help or treatment. It can foster a lack of understanding by family, friends, co-workers, or others. It can jeopardize opportunities for work, school, or social activities. It can lead to bullying, physical violence, or harassment. If you believe you have a mental illness, we encourage you to seek treatment. Don't let the fear of being labeled with a mental illness prevent you from seeking help. Treatment can provide relief by identifying what's wrong and reduce symptoms that interfere with your work and personal life. Others' judgments almost always stem from a lack of understanding rather than information based on facts. Learning to accept your condition and recognize what you need to do to treat it, seeking support, and helping educate others can make a huge difference. And with that, viewers, our time is up for tonight, sadly. Remember to join us on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. for new episodes of The Conversation right here on CBTV and on Colorblind's Facebook page. Good night and take care. Truly, take care.